as our center students make their way out through the monsoon, we'll go ahead and get going in our Ezra study. We'll begin with a word of prayer before we start our class. Mike, could you lead us off with a quick word of prayer before we start class?
Father, thank you for the opportunity we have to open your word as we dive into this study this morning, understanding about how your children came home out of captivity and the struggles they faced. Help us to see those lessons, to see where they struggled and where we struggle in our own lives and the parallels. Help us to learn their lessons and to see what it means to draw close to you and the consequences when we let obstacles get in the way. Help us all have open minds and open hearts and be engaged in discussion. Jesus, can we pray?
Amen. All right, where we left off last time, we left off with two things, actually. So we left off talking about Cyrus, and that we actually have archaeological confirmation of what the scripture declares through Isaiah and through what we read in the book of Ezra here and the book of Chronicles, that Cyrus is the one who is going to issue this decree to send the people back. And on the Cyrus cylinder that you can find at the British Museum, this is what Cyrus writes by his own hand. I returned to the sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries which had been in ruins for a long time, and the images which used to live therein, and I made them dwell there forever, and I gathered all their inhabitants and returned them to their dwellings. And so we talked about how while Cyrus was not necessarily a believer and a follower of Yahweh, he certainly does this in accordance to the will of God and is going to play into the sovereignty of God. And so that's where we technically last finished, but we also finished with some lively discussion last time as we talked about this balance, right? And what we suggested was when a lot of people think about Nehemiah and Ezra, they merely think about the physical return, but do not think about spiritual reformation, but that these books are perfectly balanced. They're even with one another. That while the physical elements of what God called for them to do are drastically important and are necessary, and we're going to bring that out, that was not the ultimate goal of God. God did not just want physical restoration of his people. He wanted spiritual restoration of his people. And that's where we ended, and we had some really good discussion about that. And Randy had some thoughts, I think, on that when we were concluding last time. Do you remember where you were going to go with that, Randy?
I'll try. Obviously the balance is there, and we need to keep the balance in perspective. God's word is inspired. From Genesis 1:1 to Revelation 22:21. Every word of it is inspired, and it's full of physical facts and dates and places and names and so forth. But we don't read it for that reason. I mean, we can, but if we do and stop there, then we are falling way short. Right. God did not intend to do all this, to share this with us, to make us intellectuals, right, to make us experts in archaeology or history. That's not the intent. But the physical there is for us to help us to see the spiritual. That's right. Cyrus was definitely a physical being, a person. And we can read about him in history, and if we just keep our mind in that avenue, then he's historical. Right. But when we put that in place with prophetic announcements through Isaiah and Jeremiah ahead of time, then that opens up the whole world of what God expects us to get from this. We see his promises, his control of things happening within the physical, and it just helps us to just reinforce the spiritual.
That's right. That's right. And this is where we kind of, finished last time. If the people had not done, and we're going to talk about this today, if the people had not done things, the physical things in the way that God wanted them to in rebuilding the wall or rebuilding the temple, would they have honored God? Everyone say no. It was drastically important that they do things according to the way God said. But were they done doing God's will simply after they finished building the wall, or after they finished building the temple? And that's what these books are going to conclude with, and that's the point, is that we're talking about balance, that we are not merely looking at the rebuilding, but we are looking at the spiritual reformation of the people. And it was a really good discussion last time. I appreciate everything that got brought out with that. Is there any other comments on that before we move on from that topic? So I wanted everyone to make sure we were on the same page and everyone had an opportunity to share something with you. All right, so let's continue in Ezra 1. And we're going to begin reading around verse 5. And if I can get a volunteer to read verses 5 through 11, that'd be fantastic. Just read the rest of Ezra 1 here for us.
So the family heads of Judah and Benjamin, along with the priests and Levites, everyone whose spirit God had roused, prepared to go up and rebuild the Lord's house in Jerusalem. All their neighbors supported them with silver articles full of goods, livestock, and valuables, in addition to all that was given as a free will offering. King Cyrus also brought out the articles of the Lord's house that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem and had placed in the house of his gods. King Cyrus of Persia had them brought out under the supervision of Mithridates, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. Was the inventory: 30 gold basins with 1,000 silver basins, 29 silver knives, 30 gold bowls, 410 silver bowls, and 1,000 other articles. The gold and silver articles totaled 5,400. Sheshbazzar brought all of them when the exiles went up from Babylon to Jerusalem.
All right. We read here of the very first individuals who are going to be redeemed and returned back from exile from the people of Babylon. And when we look at who this is going to include, the very first individuals that are going to return to Jerusalem, notice where they're from. Because when you think about the division, the split in the kingdom, who made up the southern tribes? And that might be easier than trying to come up with the northern tribes. Who made up the southern tribes? Judah and Benjamin. And so notice who it specifies is coming back. It specifies these are those who are taken captive in these waves, and they have kept their bloodline, right? They are still people of these tribes of Judah and Benjamin, though they've been estranged from their land for a period of 70 years. And now it's going to break it down even further that they're not just people from Benjamin and Judah, but we are going to have the priests and the Levites. Now, what have they been doing for the last 70 years in Babylon, the priests and the Levites?
One thing that I know is that, three priests, children, were intermingling. And when they went through the genealogy and saw that bloodline was no longer pure, they denied.
Right, we're gonna get there later on in the book of Ezra. That's right. But maybe I should go ahead, Leighton.
Somebody kept these names.
And that's going to be the reason for chapter 2. We're going to talk about that because you look at chapter 2 and think, why is this here? We're going to have a very clearly preserved lineage and genealogy that's here that was important to them. Ancestry was so important to them, partially because they knew one day they were going to go home. And who are the only ones that can serve in the temple? The priests and the Levites. So has anyone that's returned, have they actually done the work in the temple as priests, as most of the younger priests? They're born in captivity, right? They've never done this work before. But they're going back to do this work and to learn how to do this work. And so this is really fascinating for us. And then it's going to say, anyone that the Spirit of the Lord roused. There were a lot of people in captivity. And in comparison, there's actually not going to be a whole lot of people that actually come home. When we get to chapter 2, the full number after you add servants is right around 50,000 people, which is not a lot in comparison to how many were likely living in captivity at that time. But even though not everyone was able to return or in a position to return, I want you to notice what the text says. It says that all who were about them aided them. And so even if you didn't have the ability, you were too old or whatever the reason might be, that you could not return, it says that even those that were around them recognized that they needed to play their part in this. And so what was everyone doing to those that were going to go home? They were doing what?
They were aiding them.
They were aiding them how? What does the text tell us? Jacob read this for us.
Silver and gold.
Right.
Giving them all their goods.
They're trying to rebuild the nation. And it's going to take resources to be able to do that, right? And so even though not everyone can come back home, everyone is involved with this task of aiding the people and giving them what they need so that way when they come back, they can accomplish this task the Lord has given them of building the house of the Lord. They recognize, even after this many years in captivity, their responsibility to assist and sacrifice for the building up of the temple. Right? And so this is a fantastic place to start. And really, this is a good question for us. This is a question that Philip posed for the class that I want us to pass around for a minute. What example do those making the first trip to return, and even those staying behind, teach us about our role in building the Lord's kingdom today? What parallels can we see in what we've just read and things that we can do or are called to do to help build the Lord's kingdom today? Sandra.
We all have a role. We don't all have the same role. And some of us are more prominent in the building than others.
Right.
But we all have a part to play.
Not everyone's going to be Zerubbabel, right? And not everyone needs to be Zerubbabel. The body of Christ, we are one, but we are many, right? Many individuals that compose the one body. And that's why Paul spends so much time talking about if the whole body were an eye, what good would that be? Or if the whole body were an ear, what good would that be? We need every part in order to accomplish the will and work of the Lord. Yeah, Tommy.
It seems like too, passing down what you were taught is very important at this point.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because think about this. This is almost an entirely new generation. There's going to be very few that remember the days before captivity. And so how do they know all these things? How do they understand these things? And the only reason they did is because they were taught. And they were told, we sinned, right? This is why we're in captivity, but this is the promise through the prophets that was made to us. And if we are faithful to God, He's going to bring us back home. We have a responsibility to teach the next generation, to bring them up and to admonish them and teach them. And sometimes I think we can just assume that they understand why we do what we do. I really appreciate that the elders frequently want to focus on what we would call like foundational things or basic things. And because it might be the 156th time you've heard a lesson on the Lord's Supper or something of that nature in your life, but what about this next generation? If they don't understand why we're doing what we're doing, why are they doing it in the first place, right? And so there is a responsibility we have to instruct and teach and bring up the next generation. We see that here in the book of Ezra. That's a great comment. Yeah, Carrie.
One direct application is just missionary work. Very few, proportionally, of the Lord's people go to foreign fields to do missionary work, but everybody can contribute something in terms of prayer or money.
I love that.
Or
That's exactly right. And there's the same parallel there with so many things. I think about sacred selections, right, with adoption. Very few can actually adopt and have the ability and are in a place in life to do that, but so many people can make that happen and contribute to that and support that. There's a lot of parallels in those types of things. I love that, Karen. Yeah, Mike. And Ron.
And what we know about the rest of this story that we'll get to later that makes this question important too is some stayed to build, but some stayed because they were just comfortable.
That's right.
And they never came back. And they established themselves and kind of moved away from really the core of being God's people and became this quasi group that stays in the Medo-Persian Empire. And we see how that affects history later. So we've got to understand what our role is. If we're behind, then we're building. If we're going to go, then we're going to go. But we can't allow ourselves to be comfortable with, and that's really what happened to them. They became exorbitantly wealthy within Babylon and the Medo-Persian Empire. And their wealth made them comfortable, and when it was time to go home, they weren't ready to go home. I think there's a whole nother lesson about some of us maybe not ready to go home because the wealth and the things of this world have anchored us here, but I'm not gonna preach for tonight.
Isn't that a country song? Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to go down. Something like that. And so that's a great point. And chapter 2 is going to be a nod to that, by the way, of that the ones that came back in this first wave, they were the ones committed. Because what we see at the end of chapter 2, before any of them went to their homes, before any of them went and established and got settled, the first place they marched to is to the temple grounds. And that's where they go first. This is why we're here. Not to get comfortable and reestablish our lives and live. We got a job to do first. And so I love that comment. Ronnie, what did you have to say? And then Harold.
Well, it's not a comment, it's a question, so I hope I don't throw a wrench.
We'll see.
Okay, because when I read that and all about them, I'm thinking it's not the Jews.
But maybe
It's
the
other people around them, because it says Cyrus also gave them gold and stuff, so maybe they were so popular that their mission that people
Right.
outside of the Jewish community.
that is certainly a possibility, and that's not something I want to take away from the text, because that is certainly a possibility of the way that we read this, is that they have become such a part of the community around them that they are all behind this message of Cyrus sending them home. They want to help these people that have assimilated into their culture and helped them and built and made them a better nation as God told them to do. So that's certainly a possibility, absolutely. Harold.
History is a very important, if not the most important thing that we can study, besides the Bible. It does two things. History shows you what to do, also what not to do, and to put the two together and try to live your life the way it should. Because we learn from the history, we learn from our mistakes, and I think there's always work in any work that you do. There's always levels of that, you know.
Right.
Everyone can't be the leader, everyone can't be the captain or whatever, but we all can work together and to accomplish without anything that we want to.
That's right. That's right. Great comments. I really appreciate this. Yeah. Guys, you.
It reminds me, anytime I read like stories of God's people being delivered from captivity, it reminds me of, the parallel of when we're delivered from, from sin, we're slaves to sin, now we're free in Christ, and that's not the end of the story, right? Like these people are delivered from captivity, and they're not delivered from difficulty or challenge or the responsibility of obedience, right? They've got many things left to do at this point. So, an example for us, just that being delivered by God comes with responsibility.
Stephen, can you read this for us? Because you just are the perfect bridge to where we want to go here.
Sure. As you come to him, a living stone, rejected by people, but chosen and honored by God, you yourselves, as living stones, a spiritual house, are being built to be a holy priesthood to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ.
I want us to see this parallel of what we're going to read in Ezra and Nehemiah and what Peter says about us, right? We all were in captivity as well, and that captivity was in sin. And we've been delivered, but we've been delivered for a purpose. To go back to Mike's comment, we've not been delivered to get comfortable. We've been delivered to get to work, to build something. And we're going to face opposition to that. Look at what the text says. We're rejected by people, right? Just as Jesus was a rejected cornerstone, right? We're going to face the same kind of opposition to building what God has called us to build, just like Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel did. But we have a job to do, and the kind of things that we're building is not a physical building, but what is it that Peter says we are building? It's a spiritual house, which is what, of course? The church. It's you and I. We are building one another. We are the living stones that are being placed on top of one another and based on the foundation of the cornerstone of Jesus Christ. And we are the priests. Every single one of us. We are a royal priesthood, a people for his own possession, as Peter would go on to write in the next few verses, to offer spiritual sacrifices to God. Just as they were to come back and reestablish the things that were called for them to do under the law, we are called to come to Christ and get to work and to be ready to offer spiritual sacrifices. This is going to be one of our theme verses for this book. as we make application to ourselves, because there is a perfect parallel between what we see in Ezra and Nehemiah and what we're going to find our call to do for the Lord is. Really great comment. You read my notes. Thanks, Stephen. I appreciate that. Yeah, Carrie, go ahead.
I don't want to derail the discussion, but I just think this phrase, stirred up his spirit in terms of Cyrus and the people.
Right.
Is just a really interesting phrase. There's been several times in my life when I've just felt this very, very strong conviction that I needed to do something. Go to China for a month, for instance, or even move here. And God definitely does things like that. He worked on Pharaoh's heart and literally hardened his heart to accomplish his will. And I think he does stir us up in our spirit and try to convict us if we'll just listen to that.
That's right. As we read the Word and we understand things that God calls us to do, the Word is living and active. It is sharper than any two-edged sword. And it can pierce us and move us to things that maybe we've realized, I've not been evangelistic at all, right? And I need to do something. And it moves us in our spirit to do something. God's still doing that today through us as we're willing to let him do so. When we go to him, go to what he's communicated for us to do, and we open up his word and we realize we're like James, right? It's what James says, that we're not the man that looks in the mirror and goes away and completely forgets what he sees, but that we allow God to stir us up from within and convict us of the things that we look in the mirror and recognize, I need to do this, right? Because that's what we're going to see with Nehemiah. Once we get to Nehemiah, Nehemiah is convicted. He's stirred up in his spirit. How can I be of good spirit when the city that I know and that I come from is in ruins? And so it's asked him, what do you want? What do you want me to do? Send me, right? He's convicted, stirred up in his heart. Yes, Steve.
He worked for Cyrus, that you said earlier in the slide, that he
Right.
was not devoted
Right.
to God, but he had all these things in his possession that Nebuchadnezzar had brought to
Right.
his
Right.
rule. But if he was stirred up to give it back, it's not right.
Right. This is just an opinion, so I'm throwing an opinion out there. Maybe it's a brainstorm. Help me think through this. I was thinking about this morning, and it's connected to this with Cyrus and the stirring up of Cyrus. Remember what God told the people to do when they went into Babylon? What did he tell them to do specifically once they got there?
Be good citizens.
That's right. Be good citizens, right? Seek the good of the country that you're in. Imagine if they had not listened to the Lord's will and they had been a thorn in the side of Babylon and pushed back and awful citizens the whole time. Do you think Cyrus would have been stirred up in his heart to want to let them go back and rebuild and assist them? The very fact that the people were willing to listen to the Lord and the Lord encouraged them to do this might have been part of what softened Cyrus's heart to get to this position, to get to this point. These are good people. These are people that are hardworking and honor their God and honor us around them, and I want to do something for them. And I've thought about that. I don't know if I can point to that and say that was absolutely one of the things that motivated Cyrus and stirred up his heart. But it could have been that through God's will and what God had called the people to do, God knew how that would have impacted Cyrus later on. Just interesting to think about. But great comment. Any other comments or thoughts on this? All right, moving forward, Cyrus is going to return not just the people, but this is fantastic. Cyrus is going to return all of the articles from the temple that were inside of the holy place and the Holy of Holies that Nebuchadnezzar had carried off 70 years before. And what we're told is there's going to be this treasurer that is going to be named Mithredath. I told John and Allie that this was another great biblical name other than Levi. They didn't go with it. But Mithredath is going to be this treasurer who is charged with seeing that everything that had been taken is going to be returned. And he's going to entrust them to this guy named Sheshbazzar, who is the prince of Judah. And so we have some question as to who is this Sheshbazzar guy. Sheshbazzar is a Babylonian name, and it means, may the sun god protect the father. Now, this is something we need to recognize about their time in Babylon. Remember when Daniel came in? What was Daniel's name, actually, once he got there? What did they name him? Yeah, Belteshazzar, right? And then we always say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those were their Babylonian names. Their Hebrew names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Why did they do that, by the way? Why did they give everyone different Babylonian names like this when they got into captivity?
Assimilation.
All right, expand on that for us, Mike.
So it was really the whole point of what the Babylonian Empire did is, I mean, to use a terrible Star Trek reference, they were like the Borg.
Right.
They come into your city and then take the best and mold them in. And so if you remember Daniel and his companions, there was a group of them. And they were the best, the brightest, the best looking, all of those, and they brought them in, and then they rebranded them to make them Babylonian. And now what they tried to do was completely separate them from their previous history and roll them in, and then the Babylonian Empire kind of continues to grow on the strength of everybody that they conquer.
And that's why we wanted to bring this out. When you think about this, they tried to strip them of their identity to the core and of their history, as Mike said. Did the people allow that to happen? And this is what's so incredible. Even though they're returning with names that even honor these false gods, they're returning home by the protection not of the sun god, but of the God of heaven. And that's the one who is returning them back to their place. But this individual is really interesting. And so this is the point we wanted to bring out. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Quick side point here.
Please do.
Is we focus on Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But remember, there's 15 to 20 of these guys who are conspicuously absent in the fiery furnace.
Right.
Who are conspicuously absent when Daniel's in the lion's den. So some of them took to the assimilation and got grafted in. But yet it's even a remnant of the remnant that remained faithful to God and trusted in God, because all those others were gone.
Yeah, hence the small number we're going to see in Ezra chapter 2. Very good point. So who is this guy? As the kazoo kid says, wait a minute, who are you? And so he is going to be stirred to rebuild the house of the Lord. But what's fascinating is we're told that he's going to be the one who lays the foundation of the temple and is the governor of Judah. But then in chapter 5, the one who lays the foundation of the temple is Zerubbabel, and that's what we read about in chapter 2. And then in Haggai chapter 1, it says that Zerubbabel is the governor of Judah. So who is this Sheshbazzar guy, and who's really in charge? Is it Sheshbazzar or is it Zerubbabel? Well, here's a couple of options. One option that a lot of scholars tend to lean towards is that this is the same individual, just with different names. And some have thought, well, maybe it's because Zerubbabel is his Hebrew name, but the problem is that's also a Babylonian name. Okay, Zerubbabel is a Babylonian name. Sheshbazzar is a Babylonian name. But it's possible that this is just an individual that has two names, and they're describing the same person. This is the same person who is called the governor of Judah by Haggai, who is called the governor of Judah by Cyrus here, who is the one who lays the foundation of the temple, and he just goes by a couple of different names. The other possibility is that these are two individuals who are assigned to the same kind of work, the same kind of project. And maybe it's something that began with Sheshbazzar, but something happened, either he died or he was relieved, and it's something that Zerubbabel ended up taking over, right? And that happens a lot with different projects in this world, right? Someone can start a project as a project manager, but then by the time that project is completed, there's a different project manager that completes it, right? And so you ask, like, well, who's the one who built this project? You could say both names and the same title, and both of them would be accurate. It's just what timeline are we exactly looking at here? And so that's been offered by some scholars. The point is we don't really have 100% certainty. My opinion is I lean towards this being the same individual, just with different names. Philip differs from me a little bit, but he's got some other thoughts on that too. I'll let him share that with you. But just so that way we're not confused when we read this and then later on we're like, well, wait a second, I thought Sheshbazzar did that. Now we're being told Zerubbabel did that. we're not exactly certain whether it's the same guy or two individuals working on the same project. But there's that. Any other comments on chapter 1 before we spend our last 15 minutes on chapter 2? Yes, Jacob.
I'm assuming it's not important, but I was just curious. In verse 9, it talks about the inventory of these items, but then in verse 11, it says that they total 5,400. Obviously, the number of the items is 9, totals like $24.99.
Right.
If there's any reason.
So we're going to have a lot of that in Ezra. When you add up the numbers of the people that are listed in their numbers in Ezra, at the end it says their grand total was 42,000 something or other. But when you actually add up the numbers, it's 29,000 something or other. And so people go, were they really bad at math? Like, what's the reason for the discrepancy here? And the bottom line, the bottom answer is we're just not told, right? We don't know why the discrepancy. But what we're going to see is some have offered, maybe this is discussing like women and children, or maybe the articles, the total articles was this number, but the most significant things were these items. There were other items, but they weren't worth note, right? These are the most significant things that were given to rebuild. And that's some of the things that scholars have offered, but we're going to see a lot of number discrepancies. When you actually sit down, add up the numbers, you go, that's not that number. That doesn't add up. And it's left a lot of scholars arguing with each other about that. Really good math. I didn't think anyone was going to count this morning. I didn't think I was going to talk about that. Yeah, Leighton, go ahead.
I believe there's something in the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy that's relevant. God was telling them what's going to happen to them if they don't diligently obey the Lord.
That's right.
Skip on down to 36. The Lord will bring you and your king, whom you sit over you, to a nation which neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone. And here's key: you shall become a horror, a proverb, and a taunt among all the people, for the Lord guides you. They wanted them out of there.
That's right. You know what? Yeah, I almost put Deuteronomy 28 in my slideshow, Leighton, and so I'm really glad you brought that out. But this was the promise of the Lord. They would pay for what they had done. They were going to go to a place and worship in a nation that honored false gods, and it was not going to be an ideal situation for them. And God promises. And that's why they ended up in Babylon the way that they did. It's a fulfillment of the promise that God made to them if they disobeyed. Luckily, we're on the side that we're now looking at the fulfillment of the promise in Jeremiah 29, of his promise to bring them back as a remnant. But I'm really glad you brought that out, Leighton. Thank you very much. Any other comments on chapter 1 before we move on to chapter 2? I don't want to miss anything. All right, so chapter 2. As we look at chapter 2, let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 2, and then we're going to have some discussion about what the rest of this chapter says. But can I get someone to read verses 1 through 2 of Ezra?
These now are the people of the province who came from those captive exiles King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had put into Babylon. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his hometown. They came with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Reelaiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Bani. The number of Israelite men included.
All right, we'll stop there. So we're going to be given some key players that we discover here, some key names that we're going to read about throughout the rest of the book of Ezra. Two in particular. One is going to be Zerubbabel. And this man is called the son of Shealtiel. He is not a priest, though. And this is something we've got to see, because he's going to work very closely and in hand with the priests. But he is not called one of the priests, but he's going to work alongside closely with the priests. And he's really going to be the primary leader in chapters 1 through 6. It's called the book of Ezra, which is ironic because we don't even see Ezra appear until chapter 7, and he makes an appearance in chapters 7 through 10. And then, of course, we read about Ezra, the book of Nehemiah as well. But Zerubbabel is our main character through the majority of the book of Ezra. And Haggai is going to call him the same title that was given to Sheshbazzar in chapter 1, the governor of Judah, according to Haggai chapter 1 and verse 1. And Haggai is a prophet that is going to be working amongst the people as they're trying to rebuild. We see this in chapter 5 of the book of Ezra. And so this is the main character we want to keep in mind as we start our study. These other guys I just want to bring up because sometimes names jump out at us. It's kind of like Darius that we read about last time. We think, Darius, it must be Darius the Mede. No, that was Darius the Great that we're going to read about. It's a different Darius. When you see Nehemiah and Mordecai, is this the same Nehemiah as in the book of Nehemiah? No, because where's the other Nehemiah? The one we're going to read about later on. He's back there, right? And he's going to be a cupbearer for the king, and he's not going to come until one of the next waves that comes back in captivity. So this is not the same Nehemiah. And then Mordecai, who immediately pops up in our mind when we see this name. Right. No, this is not the same Mordecai, right? This is a different Mordecai that we're reading about. The timeline does not line up, even though Esther is going to take place during this time period. The timeline does not line up for this to be the same individual who is returned back to Jerusalem. The other primary name we need to know is Jeshua. Yours might say Joshua. And he is going to be the high priest, according to both Zechariah and Haggai, who are the contemporary prophets helping with the rebuilding at this time. It is going to be Jeshua who is going to be the one that has to teach all of these new priests of how to do what they are called to do and to look at the law and study it and preserve it. And this is he's going to play a very, very key role in the rest of this book and what we read. All right, so when we look at chapter 2, this is one of those chapters that sometimes makes us scratch our head because we believe it, but sometimes we don't understand how. When we read all Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching and for reproof and for correction and for training in righteousness. Because when you look at the majority of chapter 2, did anyone do their homework and actually read through every single one of these names? Good job, Terry. Good job, Chloe. This is a long, extensive list of everyone who came back from captivity, and that's almost what the entire chapter is about for some 60 verses, right? So let's break this down into sections. We're not going to read every single one of these names. I'm not mean, right? I'm not going to make you read, like, who made someone read Romans 16 at the end? Was that you, Randy, or was that Jonathan? I think that was you. But when you look at this list of names, this is how it's broken down. We're going to see, first of all, individual families alongside their number that are brought back from captivity from Babylon and returned to Jerusalem. Then in verses 21 through 25, 35, it's not going to be individual families, but it's going to be individual towns, entire towns that returned alongside their number, that enough of the people from this place returned that they just said, this place, Bethel, Migdash. And so then we're going to see individual priestly families are broken down. And beginning in verse 36 down through verse 39, along with their number. And then outside of the priests, now it's going to broaden a little bit more, and now we're going to have the Levitical families, followed by, specifically within the Levitical families, the temple singers, then the gatekeepers in verse 42, and then the temple servants in verses 43 through 53, along with what is called the descendants of Solomon's servants, which is not a question you need to direct at me. That is a question for Philip Smith, because I still am trying to figure this out. But he's got some really good thoughts on this to share with y'all, so plug him next time you see him on Wednesday. And then finally, this is going to be a very important point we do want to talk about. There is a whole section that is given and lists the names of individuals that could not prove their ancestral lineage. Now, Mike's already talked about this. How could that have happened when you think about this? This is 70 years have gone by, they've been in captivity, but there is a massive demographic of people at the end of chapter 2 that cannot prove their ancestry, 652 of them. Why is this significant? Here.
Well, I doubt if there was a library in Babylon dedicated to the history of the Jewish people and their lineage.
Right. They don't have any of the resources that are available to them that they used to have, right? That's all been burned, it's been destroyed, it's been, gotten rid of. They had nothing to go on other than word of mouth, what they had been told, but they could not prove their ancestry. Yeah, Mike.
Well, and this is the other problem with the Jews leading up prior to captivity is they forgot that this was important. And so it wasn't in certain families, yes, it was handed down. This is where we came from. The stories were told. They told them all the way back to the great, 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 great grandfathers. But other families didn't care. And they
Right.
got so lost in sin and separated from God that that wasn't a primary means. And, you know, I think sometimes we look at these years and it's hard for us to put them in context. But 70 years from now put us at 1955. Right? So think about all the things that have happened in our lifetime, in our culture, in our country, from 1955 to today, and then kind of overlay that with where they're at. Generations have passed, they're in a new place, and haven't been talking enough about the history. You let a couple grandparents die, and your whole family history is lost.
And this is going to be so important. And I want to lead in with this question, and we're going to talk about it with our remaining time here, which is just a few minutes. What's the point? Right? Why record all of these families and different individuals so specifically to begin this book? Why is this significant to them? Why is this important for us to understand? Sandra, go ahead.
Because Christ is going to come to a particular family.
Okay, this is going to do somewhat with the promises, right? They're still looking for the Messiah. And ancestry is going to be so important to the people of God, right? So important to the people of God. For primarily that purpose, right? But there's going to be some other reasons why it's important ancestry is to them as well. Because if they're going to come back, they have to come back right. And that's what Mike brought out earlier, right? They're coming back to work. But are there very clear physical specifications of how that work is supposed to be accomplished when they come back home? Yes, Samuel.
There is, and who is supposed to accomplish what in the worship?
That's exactly right. They are going to have very specific requirements. If they're going to come back to rebuild the temple and restore temple sacrifice and all of these things, they need to be certain that the ones that are functioning as priests and in temple service are actually supposed to be doing so. That's why at the end of chapter 2 here, when there were those that could not prove their ancestral history, look at what it says in verse 63. The governor ordered them not to eat the most holy things until there was a priest who could consult the Urim and Thummim. Because they could not absolutely prove that they were priests, they were not going to chance it, right? There needed to be a consultation from God to ensure they were doing it God's way. And so this chapter is so important to us with understanding their lineage, because they're coming back to build and they're coming back to do it right. They don't want to end up right back in the same place that they come from. Yes, Sandra.
Another problem is these people were taken as slaves, and that means that children were often separated from parents.
Right.
So a child might know I'm Jewish, but I don't remember my parents'
Right.
names.
Right. And so how are they going to prove all this? Yeah, Ronnie.
To me, the other real reason is the same reason they specify 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. Because that makes it real.
That's right.
It's a history log that makes you say this is, because other things are just so broad, they don't get details, but these little chapters for me help me see this is a historical event, break down the number of horses.
I love that, right? It doesn't just give us general numbers, around 50,000 and, quite a few horses. They numbered them. And this historical record, like a receipt, is given to us. And that is a very big faith booster. I love that comment. Very good. Other things of why this is important. We just for sake of time, we'll go through a couple of these. One, it shows the detailed fulfillment of the promises of God. God cared for everyone, right? It was not just a number to the Lord. God knew every single specific family that was going to return. And this is also no small undertaking, right? We need to recognize this in the details. This is, even though it's not a great number of the people in comparison to what they would have become in Babylon, to be able to move and transport 50,000 people down to where they're going to be and become reestablished. That's a big undertaking, right? And that's brought out for us in the text. But I think the other thing we see here is this shows what Sandra brought out earlier in what we can learn about our role in the kingdom, is this shows the plethora and the diversity that was needed to fulfill this task. This was not something that one or a small group of people could return back to Jerusalem to do. They needed everybody. And everybody played a very different, significant role in accomplishing this work. Derek Kidner writes this in his commentary from the Old Testament out of the Tyndale series, and it got cut off there at the bottom. I apologize. But he says, this chapter, however uninviting it may seem, is a monument to God's care and to Israel's vitality. The thousands of homecomers are not lumped together, but in characteristic biblical fashion related to those local and family circles which humanize a society and orient an individual. That's exactly what Ronnie just said. And he goes on to say, and for the people's part, their tenacious memory of places and relationships, still strong after 2 generations in exile, showed a fine refusal to be robbed of either their past or their future. And that was Mike's point. I really like how Derek brought this out, and it's already been brought out in this class of why this chapter is important. We have no time left, but I just want you to notice this. When they come back, it says, after they arrived at the Lord's house in Jerusalem, some of the family heads gave free will offerings to the house of God in order to have it rebuilt on its original site. And based on what they can give, it explains exactly what they gave. And then it says they returned back to their homes and settled in their towns. And I want you to just notice this first order of business. Before the people settle in their homes, the very first thing they do is they march to the former site of the temple. And this demonstrates everything Mike was talking about earlier. This demonstrates priority. They were not coming back to just settle down and get comfortable and resume their lives. They were coming back to do a job. And the first place they went was to ground zero. And just as there were free will offerings before they left, there is a second round of free will offerings that is taken up in order to accomplish this work that God has called them to do. And we'll leave off here, and Philip can tackle this on Wednesday if he wants to, but the thought question is, what does the people's generosity teach us regarding our work for the Lord, and how does generosity assist in building up what is now the temple of God? And we can talk about that on Wednesday. But any other last comments or thoughts before we close? We're out of time. Yeah, Gary?
I wanted to point out in verse 65 that approximately 1/6 of the people that went back were servants or slaves. So the slaves had their own servants and slaves.
That's right. Isn't that incredible? They had gotten comfortable, as we said. Very good. All right. Thanks, guys. We'll pick up on Wednesday, and Philip will teach. Read chapter 3.